6 upheavals in 5 months have rocked the Arab world. Thanks to a new generation of revolutionaries in Tunisia and Egypt. But some are resisting. Others are fighting back to keep their power at any cost. As the Arab Spring heats up,
33 years are enough, please go out.
We ask how long, how costly, and how real is the promised change? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. The Arab Revolution is still going strong despite setbacks. Fear has switched sides. Undeterred by violence and oppression, the people are on the march. Autocrats are on the defensive. In Tunisia and Egypt, the revolution has been relatively peaceful. The ruling families and associates have fled or been put on trial for corruption and other criminal charges. Their infamous internal security apparatus has been closed down, their long governing parties banned, and their properties confiscated. But in Libya, Yemen, Syria and Bahrain, the situation has deteriorated into widespread violent confrontations, leading to outright war and foreign military intervention, as the regime will stop at nothing to resist change. But change is inevitable, and there is no turning back. Why? Well, it's rather straightforward. For more than half a century, the Arab world has lived under a cloud. From Algeria to Yemen, dictators and autocrats grabbed and held onto power, enforcing their will on their long-suffering people, declaring states of emergency that lasted decades. Human rights were ignored as jails filled up with political prisoners, and torture was commonplace. Governments have shut down independent newspapers, arrested journalists, and blocked TV stations. With 40% of the population living in poverty and youth unemployment rampant, something had to give. Joining me to discuss the evolution of the Arab Revolution are Dr. Rabab el-Mahdi, Professor of Political Science at the American University of Cairo and editor of Egypt, Moment of Change, and Christopher Dickey, author and the Middle East editor of Newsweek, and Patrick Seale, or rather Dr. Patrick Seale, author of The Struggle for Arab Independence, among others. But first, we recall the beginnings of the Arab Spring and the role of the youth in making it all happen.
In a land of many tribes, another one has emerged. A new Arab from a miracle generation.
This hidden force is managed by thousands of youth smart brains.
There are 180 million young Arabs across the region, with common goals and common language.
These demonstrations were a result of people's anger at regimes founded upon oppression, despotism, injustice, and lack of freedom.
Armed with laptops and mobile phones,
we could get all the news, we can be chat together, all our communication.
This generation transcends deserts and seas, united by youthful energy and passion for political reform. The catalyst was Tunisia, where millions of young people rose up against a dictator who had ruled for their entire lives. It was the spark that the miracle generation needed. And it spread like wildfire.
In Egypt, the revolution was not a surprise. There had been an accumulation of work. We kept in touch with the young people of Tunisia via Facebook, and all that was needed was the spark to move the people.
Preparing, organizing, motivating, on the web and on the street.
We have to make sure our activists know what to do in the street. One group will be in charge of the square, another will show people where food, water and blankets are. Others will arrange fast aid.
Our aim is democracy and freedom for this country. It's great to see that now all the people had managed to get rid of the excessive fear and loss of hope.
But the revolution isn't over. The old guard is still calling the shots.
I realized that it was not the end. It was just the beginning.
In Egypt and throughout the region, the young are networking, sharing tips on how to overthrow their oppressors.
The Tunisians sent us a manual, how to deal with armored vehicles, with tear gas bombs, with electric shock batons, with police cordons and so on. They suggested we start our demonstrations at night, as the security forces would be exhausted. There were protesters who would come to Egypt from Libya to relay what was taking place in their country and seek our advice.
Young Libyans are fighting to overthrow a despot who has crushed them for decades.
All Gaddafi has done is scare us, but we are not afraid anymore.
And in Jordan, the youth are challenging the monarchy. Across the Red Sea in Yemen, political change is all that matters to the 18 million people under 30.
Yemen was founded in 1990 as a democratic state. Year on year, it is turning into a dictatorship. I am part of a peaceful youth students' revolution.
We want to get an education. We want to put an end to unemployment, poverty, and illiteracy.
Young Yemenis learned valuable lessons from their brothers and sisters in Tahrir Square.
We searched everyone coming in to stop them from bringing weapons.
But not everyone has given up their weapons. President Saleh is gunning down dozens of his own people. In Bahrain, the young are protesting and dying for change. And in Syria, demonstrators took to the streets when the regime imprisoned teenagers. Teenagers that were murdered by their own regime, quashing their dreams of freedom. The young are determined and fearless, prepared to pay the bloody price for change.
I have to admit it, our generation, when we started the 90s Intifada, we couldn't get into that limit. We were not brave so much like these people. I have to remove my cap respecting them. These are the new generation, the internet generation.
Rabab, as we've seen in the report, there is no doubt that youth have led this movement in the Arab world. But how much is it become a cliche, a sort of a media construct rather than a political construct?
It's absolutely a construct. The problem is that the construct does not only stop at making it, a youth revolution, but the youth is being constructed along quintessential middle class line. So all the people that we saw, a lot of them are people I know personally and good friends, but they represent a particular class that has this access to the internet, specific forms of education and training. And those are actually the minority.
But what's wrong with middle class youth leading?
Because what made this a so-called revolution was not about those activists.
When you say so-called revolution, you don't think of it as a revolution?
I don't think it's a revolution yet. I think we're looking at very strong uprisings, revolutions in the making. But revolution, as we've known it, assumes structural change that we haven't seen yet in any of the Arab countries.
Chris, mass mobilization for radical change, that sounds a revolution to me.
I think in common parlance, this is really a revolution. You have a huge generational change. But it's also true that the so-called leaders of this, they're icons more than they are leaders. And the leadership of this revolution has been developing for a long, long time. I mean, for at least 10 years, you've had labor movements, you've had professional associations, you've had protests, you've had the language of the street taking shape, which was vital to what happened in January and February. But it was not going to have that mass effect until you got those middle-class kids and Facebook and all those elements coming into play. Tunisia, technology, and then this foundation of protests that had been developing for the last 10 years or so.
I need to disagree with this, because in a revolution you would assume that the revolutionaries take over power, and this is something that we haven't seen.
The fact that the ruling party has been banned, the fact that the internal security organs all have been dismantled, the fact that the ruling families are either on the run or on trial, that certainly is the beginning of a revolution, no?
Beginning. I would definitely say it's a revolution in the making. But you don't have revolutions where the leadership of the new regime is not with the revolutionaries, and this is everywhere.
That happens everywhere. After every revolution, there's a moment of uncertainty as new forces emerge. But I think what's interesting, Marwan, is that the motor of this revolution in almost every country which we've seen has been very much the same. It is the new middle-class poor. And these young people come out of these institutions, whether universities or schools, and find there are no jobs for them. So it's youth unemployment, half-educated youth, and yet young people have been watching satellite television, seeing how other people live, seeing consumerism, and wanting the sort of freedoms and the economic benefits which other people have had in other parts of the world. And so you get this sort of incredible explosion. So of course it's a revolution. It's overthrown, or several dictators already, threatened others, spreading right across. But of course the final governments which will emerge from these revolutions, we don't yet know.
So we know they are a force of nature, if you will, and we know that there is social forces and causes for their upheaval. But are they unified?
Are they unified? Fortunately not. The whole point about these revolutions is that it's a multi-layered, multi-stranded revolution.
Chris, you just came back from Egypt. The fact that they don't have one single ideology, the fact that they do come from all strands and all political orientations, is that an advantage or a disadvantage for the revolution?
I think in Egypt it's an advantage, because I don't think that you have a strong ideological current that's going to dominate this uprising or this developing revolution. And I think the army's role has been interesting, because it rescued the leadership, or the quasi-leadership of the revolution. When they pushed Mubarak's back to the wall, he was going down, and it wasn't clear what was going to replace him or how he could be replaced or what the way out of it was. The army stepped in. And the army, a lot of us thought that, okay, it's not really a revolution at all, it's a coup d'etat. But the army has turned out to be more flexible than we expected.
It was neutral.
Well, it wasn't entirely neutral, and it hasn't been a bunch of good guys all the time, and they've done some pretty bad things.
And they certainly have been procrastinating.
Well, they've been procrastinating. They're not procrastinating as much as some people like Mohammed al-Baradei and others would like, because who feel that essentially the elections are going to come on too fast, and no party is going to really have a chance to organize except the ones that are already organized, notably the Muslim Brotherhood. But the military is trying to find its way forward, even if it's, as one of my Egyptian friends said, even if it's like walk like an Egyptian, one step forward, two steps back sometime, you have a process that's positive.
But the same thing we've seen in Tunisia even before Egypt, Rabab. What is so particular about them that they had such a relatively peaceful change with the military setting basically on the side?
I think what we're talking about is definitely a professional, established military. I think the military, having been part of the regime, but a privileged part of the regime, had to save the day somehow, and in doing so, they were saving themselves as an establishment, right? Because if you don't step in and take that stand that you took in Tunisia or Egypt, the next thing you know, you'll be falling down with the
they weren't so unhappy seeing the dictators go away as long as the military stays safe.
Exactly, and that's not the case in other Arab countries. It's definitely not the case in Libya.
Egypt is an ancient country, ancient institutions. It's been a country for thousands of years. And that's a great advantage, of course, compared to countries like Yemen, where after 62, they destroyed a 1,000-year-old imamate, and the revolution hasn't settled down really since 1962. The same in Libya, it's one-man show, hardly any institutions. And so everything has to be rebuilt. Whereas in Egypt, they have an army, they have a bureaucracy, they have a foreign service, which is one of the best.
In Egypt, they have a history of democratic experimentation that goes back a long way, too.
Well, of course.
Yes, it was under colonial domination, but it was still an extensive experiment with democracy, and you have the institutions. If we talk about Saudi Arabia, for instance, democratizing Saudi Arabia, how would you do that?
No tradition.
Where's the parliament? Where are the courts? Where are the independent? Where's an independent judiciary?
They have other traditions which are not necessarily the same as Western traditions.
Let's talk about this for a second. Is this a movement towards change, unknown change, or is it really a movement towards democracy?
Democratic change involves many things. It involves, for example, an electoral law which everybody believes in. It requires a number of political parties, well-established political parties, able to compete properly with each other, not perhaps dominated by one very powerful party. It means an independent judiciary, so people can go. It means that people can choose the people they want to represent them.
And you don't see the signs now, the Prosecutor General in Tunisia and Egypt putting all the elites on trial, the fact that they are creating new political parties in various parts, not only in Tunisia and Egypt, but other places.
They've begun by dissolving the major party, after the National Democratic Party. That's been dissolved. Somebody has to take its place. The Muslim Brothers are still there, perhaps the largest single, like a big NGO, with hundreds of thousands of people. Well, is it going to convert itself into a powerful political party and perhaps seize power?
Let's talk about this elephant in the big elephant in the room.
Yeah.
How substantial would we think the Islamist element is going to be in the future of Egypt, Tunisia, and other places?
I think, first of all, we have to understand that this revolution was not, there wasn't any dominant political force that would eventually take the lead, right? Unlike Iran or in other places. So the Muslim Brotherhood were not initiators, did not play a huge role. The other thing we have to understand when we talk about political Islam, there are different trends there. So it's not the Islamists on one side and the secular forces on one side. That's a very simplistic way of understanding things.
You think there's an evolution within the Islamist movement?
Absolutely, absolutely, because you have different trends within political Islam in Egypt, competing with each other, calling for different things, and some of them actually are ready to ally with parts of the secular forces.
Is this the generational? Is this a generational question that the younger brotherhood
Again, it's not generational. I mean, we need to get out of this box of thinking along the lines of young, old, internet, no internet, traditional, modern. We're seeing competition within that camp of the political Islam, within the camp of the seculars. We're seeing alliances being built between some parts of the Islamist forces and the seculars. And I think the dividing line should be between those who want another system and those who are for the ancien regime, if you may, or the old regime.
A lot of people in the West see this as hugely problematic. The whole idea that's developing in Egypt that liberal economy, that a free market economy is a bad idea for Egypt, that it resulted in crony capitalism, and therefore the whole notion is very negative. There are a lot of people, especially a lot of Americans, who will say, you know, look, Egypt had its problems, but it had this huge youth bulge, has huge unemployment problems, and at least it had an economy that was growing 6–7% a year, even in 2008, 2009, at the height of the global recession. So that was a good thing.
But the distribution of wealth wasn't exactly.
The distribution of wealth was not good, but on the other hand, wealth was being created. You may well have a situation now where no wealth is being created, where the economy essentially is going to flatline, and where you have, instead of creating a few 100,000 jobs, you have 1 million more people unemployed in the next couple of months.
The problem so far, if you've noticed, if you look at the region, you'll see that the rulers, the autocrats, the old generation, has been pursuing, let's call it, the Beijing consensus. But the problem is that the younger generation of dictators, their sons and daughters, have been pursuing the Washington consensus, which is complete privatization of state assets, complete corruptions and nepotism and so on and so forth. So something got to give. There has to be a third model, perhaps an Arab new Egyptian model?
Well, that would be a really interesting idea, but it seems to me that what you see a lot of in Egypt is a kind of a return, a kind of a longing to return to Arab socialism, a kind of a longing not to develop a new model, but to go back to an old model. I think there is this feeling that things were so unfair that basically the government should intervene a lot more than it used to do.
But is there Rabab, an alternative to market economy? Is it even conceivable?
It's definitely conceivable, and I think the longing that Chris was talking about is not about Arab socialism per se, but it's a longing for a moment where there was a certain level of equity, there was a certain level of a sense of possibility that you can be someone else, you can do something else.
The trouble is, Marwan, you see, there is no magic wand in these relatively poor countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, even Syria. The surge of population, however great the growth, 6 or 7%, cannot keep up with this huge surge of population. When Nasser took power, as you know, there were 18 million Egyptians. Four decades later, 84 million, increasing by about 1 million a year. You have to run to stand still. You see, so the Arab countries, I believe, the oil-rich Arab countries with these huge sovereign wealth funds have to chip in.
We're not talking about poverty, we're talking about impoverishment. We're talking about strong problems of distribution that we haven't seen even under Sadat, let alone Nasser.
So what you're saying is that youth are not exactly the biggest disaster of all. In fact, they could be the best potential for building a nation.
Of course. You need to have a different understanding of what kind of developmental model you want to put across.
No development model will work if you have fertility rates which go through the roof.
I think everybody was saying there's this youth bulge, there's this unemployment problem, but I don't think before these revolutions anybody understood how well connected this new generation was to each other and to the rest of the world. And it's not just the internet, it's also satellite television. And it's not just wanting things, it's about understanding things. I mean, under Nasser, under Sadat, in the early days of Mubarak, Egypt was in many ways an isolated society. People lived within the closed world of Egypt. You didn't have television from outside. You couldn't communicate with outside.
And Egyptians didn't travel.
All that has changed. And all of it's changed in Egypt, and it's changed in just about every other country.
By the way, even when we talked about the first awakening back in the beginning of the 20th century, it was then that we start talking about the effect of trains and press and the cosmopolitan areas.
Can we not use the word awakening? Because I'm very allergic to that word.
Why is that?
I mean, it assumes as if we were sleeping.
But we were dormant.
We were dormant. That's absolutely the wrong reading, not only of history, but even of current events. We're talking about a region that was very active with the Second Intifada, 2000. Again, very active with the American invasion of Iraq, sweeping demonstrations, 2006. Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and then the Gaza war, and in between you had Kifaya in Egypt, the pro-democracy movement. You had the similar movement in Yemen, 2005.
There has been an evolution before the revolution.
We weren't dormant, okay? The fact that you weren't looking doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
But to have had an evolution to the revolution doesn't mean that there were those scenes and the results that we've seen in Egypt in 11, 12, 15 days, an entire regime falling down that's been around for 5 decades.
This was watching the regime come down. I was on the ground there at the time. Well, the thing that struck me again and again was that Hosni Mubarak was 82 years old, and he had gone into the presidential bubble in 1981, and he had literally no idea how his society had changed.
In denial.
Absolutely.
It wasn't even denial. It was obliviousness.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're
out of touch.
Gaddafi since 69, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen since 78, Mubarak since 81.
We want to talk about the commonality and the differences among these Arab countries, but when we come back from a quick news break. Welcome back. There's been lots of discussion about the role of social media in the evolution of the Arab Revolution, and we've done our share of it here at Empire. But it has been the combination of social media and satellite media that has led to the information revolution and connected the Arab-speaking region like never before. And no other network has been as central to this discussion as our own, Al Jazeera. Once the Arab regimes lost control over information, it was only a question of time for them to lose control of the people.
This is blatant interference in Yemeni affairs. What the Qatari initiative offered and what Al Jazeera is coming up with is rejected.
They always fall into the same trap. They try to distort the clear facts. They lie and then they believe their lies.
Do not believe those satellite channels, those dogs.
If the first casualty of war is truth, that explains why regimes clinging to power always aim their fury at the media. So it's no surprise that in each of these revolutions, heavy-handed tactics have been employed to try and control what the media sees and what it's allowed to show.
I had a live show and I was told to speak about, foreigners fomenting unrest, specifically Iran and Israel.
And if you can't control the message, you can always just try to switch it off.
Okay, listen, I just want to tell you that it seems that police are knocking on our door.
At the end of January, Egyptian authorities pulled the plug on Al Jazeera in an unsuccessful bid to knock it off air. The same methods used on internet servers and mobile phone providers. This pattern is being repeated every time protesters take to the streets demanding change. Reporters from around the world have been routinely harassed, detained, and news agencies disrupted. All the while, the official message becoming more and more absurd.
There are more than 3 million pro-Mubarak demonstrators here. Every street in Egypt now has a demonstration in favor of Papa Mubarak.
This so-called eyewitness going on to insist those calling for change had in fact been trained by an unusual alliance of the CIA, the Mossad, and the Muslim Brotherhood. A claim the protesters themselves found hilarious.
I love Mr. Bush. Bush is Bush. I love Mr. Bush.
It was very clear to me that people on the streets were dismissing state media coverage as propaganda, especially when I went to Tahrir and I saw the level of anger. People were genuinely very angry at state TV for the lies that they were spreading.
And just as the regimes have their tactics, the people on the streets have theirs as well. Whenever the state-controlled message has been revealed as a sham, protesters simply ignore it.
Revolutionaries will use any tool they can in order to achieve their goal. And I think it's fair to say that Al Jazeera is one of those tools that revolutionaries will try and reach for because it is the most influential non-state actor in the Middle East.
So what we're seeing is protesters improvising new ways of circumventing state-controlled means of communication. If there's one vital element to this concept, it's the fact that technology is an extremely powerful amplifier.
What would happen is youths in Tunisia, for example, would film things with their mobile phone and they would upload it to a video sharing website, and then Al Jazeera would find it and then they would broadcast it.
However, there is a risk satellite channels like Al Jazeera face right now, and that is in taking too much credit for shaping these events. Their true value in these revolutions lies not in opinion or criticism, but as a means of increasing exposure. And for these protesters, exposure is everything. That's the kind of influence which used to frighten the West.
What Al Jazeera is doing is vicious, inaccurate, and inexcusable.
Now the West is beginning to catch up.
You've got a set of global networks that Al Jazeera has been the leader in that are literally changing people's minds and attitudes. And like it or hate it, it is really effective.
But before the media gets too pleased with itself, the reality is that right now, the job is only half done.
It's very important for people to see what is happening in their countries, but also in other countries. It's their basic right to information. They should not be denied this basic right.
At the moment, the media in post-revolutionary Arab countries like Egypt and Tunisia has an extremely important role because society generally is depending on the media in the absence of an opposition to hold those in power to account.
So, Rabab, the question of satellite Arab media, aside from the social media, it certainly had a major effect in connecting the Arab world together. This domino effect, Tunis, followed by Egypt, followed by other countries. The kind of social questions we discussed are actually common to other countries as well. But what we've seen over the last 6 months, 5 months, is an Arab revolution, and so on. How important is that?
I think the TV, the satellite channels were extremely important, much more important as a tool than the so-called social media, because this is something that no matter where you are, what your class is, whether you have access, you can see it. You can see it in a coffee shop. You can see it everywhere. But I think what was extremely important is that it was a tool to show people that, you know, sort of, yes, we can. And I think a key thing was the Egyptians, regular Egyptians who were not active or anything, saw Tunisia televised, revolution televised.
So
that was key.
So in fact, the satellite effect is by default, not necessarily by design, Chris.
Well, it's just a reality that has to be coped with these days, and I think it's a very positive thing. I think Al Jazeera and other Arab language sites have helped resurrect a sense of Arab identity, collective Arab identity, that's very strong, that really had been sort of subsumed beneath the Islamist trend earlier.
I agree with that.
I think that's very, very striking. And I think it's interesting, you know, as we talk about these dynamics. If we
so you think there's strength in that?
Oh, I do think there's
unity
strength in
that understanding.
And I think that it's an interesting contrast with Iran, for instance, where you had the same dynamic, where you had uploading of video, uploading of photographs, coming back on outside Persian service television, but that doesn't have the following in Iran that Al Jazeera has in the Arab world or other Arab language satellite networks have in the Arab world. So I think that it really is a revolutionary phenomenon, whether it was designed that way or not.
It's a unifying factor. You see, the Arabs now are much closer together, know more about what's going on in various Arab countries than ever before. It's a little bit, you know, Nasser's Voice of the Arabs played that role a little bit, though it was largely propaganda, but at least everybody listened to it.
So Pan-Arabism now is satellite?
Well, absolutely. It's a new form of Pan-Arabism.
So while this is, and you've been observing this region for a long time, so while this presumably is a positive development, that satellite media is helping people break national barriers and dictatorial barriers, it's still being looked upon, and in reality, unfortunately on the ground, it's still becoming or unfolding into separate, different cases.
Well, that's inevitable. You know, every Arab country is different from every other, and yet they are all learning from each other, and they know much more about each other than they ever did before. You know, it's always struck me that when Nasser, for example, united with Syria in 1958, he'd never been to Syria. He united with a country he'd never seen. It's an astonishing thought. Very few Egyptians had gone outside of the Nile Valley, whereas now, of course, there are more than 1 million in Libya, lots and lots in the Gulf and elsewhere. So there's been a sort of great movement, great unifying movement, which I think the Arabs will develop a collective voice and perhaps a collective power, which they haven't had for a long time.
I think that you can have a growing sense of collective identity, which will become maybe a framework for discussions.
Yes.
But all politics is local. And I think the local factors in each one of these countries are hugely powerful.
Except for foreign policy, it's not local.
I think we're not talking about a dichotomy here. Definitely there's the local specifics of each situation that has to do not only with the society, but also with how the regime is structured, how the state came about. But we're talking about common trends. The independent state was a common trend in the 60s and the 70s. The neoliberal state was a common trend in the 80s and the 90s. And I think what we're looking at here is the more democratic states becoming a trend, even in places where the revolution in the making was crushed. So, I cannot see that Bahrain or Oman are going to escape this, despite all what happened, without having to introduce much more foundational reforms.
I think one of the really striking things is the way we've seen suddenly the Arab world move out of the post-colonial construct. It seems to me that even a year ago, any time we talked about any kind of collective identity in the Arab world or even the Muslim world, we would have been talking about occupation and the fight against occupation and wars for national liberation and all of that as driving forces. That seems really peripheral to what's going on now, because it's a generation, because of this generational change. The generation that is now pushing all of this is a generation that had no direct colonial experience of occupation.
If we had fourth generation, the liberation generation post-colonialism that helped liberate, the defeated generation of the 60s and the 70s, the lost generations of the 80s and the 90s, today we definitely are seeing a new miracle sort of generation. But is it picking up from the 50s generation that you spoke about earlier?
Well, I think that foreign pressures and occupations are still very much with the Arab world. After all, it was only the other day that you had the first Gulf War of 1991, 500,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia, which created, after all, al-Qaeda after a while. Then you had the occupation of Iraq, which is one of the great crimes of our time.
But let's look at this, Patrick. The
Yes.
question of Iraq.
Yes.
How could it be in any stretch of imagination be compared with Libya? Everyone knows that with the foreign intervention in Libya, it's not going to have the same future as in Iraq or anyone else because of the Arab will.
I hope not. I mean, the Iraq thing was a catastrophe, a destruction of a major Arab country. 4 or 5 million people driven out either as refugees or displaced in their own country.
But what I mean is it's becoming much more difficult with a more responsive, democratic, free Arab world for Arab leaders to become clients to Western domination.
Of course, but I mean, that's what we hope to see in Egypt. We hope to see an end to that complicity with Israel, which Mubarak, after all, practiced for so many years.
Talk about Syria as well, since you are the Mr. Expert here in Europe on the question of Syria.
Well, you see, in Syria, the fact that I think Bashar al-Assad's mind has been formed by the many crises he's had to confront. You see, he had barely come to power when you got George Bush's global war on terror. Then you got the invasion of Iraq. And he knew very well that if the Americans had been successful in Iraq, he'd have been blown away. Then you got the 2005 crisis in Lebanon. Again, where he was forced out of Lebanon, France and the United States tried to overthrow his regime. His mind was marked by that. Then, of course, he had the invasion of Lebanon in 2006, invasion of Gaza 2008 and 2009. So his whole mind and policies have been focused on foreign threats. And in a hostile environment of that sort, the security services become very strong. Very, very strong. And that's something he inherited from his father. So he was focused on external crises at the expense of
So there seems to be never a good time to reform after 11 years of power?
Well, I think he's understood now that he has to reform, but it's perhaps a bit late.
You know, look, Patrick said something that is very striking to me. He said the Gulf War of 1991 was just yesterday. Well, no, it wasn't just yesterday. It was 20 years ago, Patrick. Well, I mean, half the population of Yemen was not born 20 years ago.
Yemen has had their own crises.
You always have the constant reminders.
You have the constant reminders, but the
2003,
but who's doing the reminding? Who's doing the reminding? Look at even Mubarak. He may have been perfectly complicit with Israel in terms of crushing Gaza, but he also was playing a game domestically in which you were going to be investigated by the Amn al-Dawla or the Muhammadat if you went to Israel. I mean, that was what the Cold Peace was about, convincing the Egyptians that Israel was still the enemy and the issue.
But apparently it wasn't enough.
I think Israel is so irrelevant to what's going on. I think it's just not central at all.
How can you say that?
I think Israel may have a lot of concerns about this, but I think in terms of the push, in terms of yes, a lot of the organizers had organized for pro-Palestinian or anti-occupation.
2 Arab countries in the last few years.
But I think it is absolutely irrelevant to the youth movement that we're
You don't think that youth movement was pretty much critical, if not condemning, of all Israeli practices?
Israel has been used as an excuse by the regimes so often to cover up all their failings. Even Mubarak used Israel as an excuse that I think that ultimately that's not the issue for people. I think there may be huge problems ahead for Israel, and that's a different discussion, because it won't have reliable dictators to play its
Actually,
game.
I would like to go into the discussion. So within the neighborhood, we have these 3 emerging powers. If you looked at the situation back in autumn 2010, you would find a complete absence of the Arabs, but the emergence of Israel, the emergence of Iran, and certainly the emergence of Turkey. How would you rate the effect of what's going on in the Arab world on the foreign policy of Turkey, Iran, and Israel?
Well, certainly Turkey has emerged as a major player and a beneficent player, as a player which is attempting to resolve conflicts, which has used its trade and its economy to improve relations.
Look at Syria. Isn't Ankara looking at Syria as if it's part of its own area of influence rather than part of the Arab landscape?
I mean, Turkey is a very important player. It's helped Syria a great deal. It's relieved perhaps a slightly suffocating relationship with Iran. It's created a no-visa zone between Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. And it's advised, Erdogan has advised President Bashar to adopt democracy on the Turkish model.
How about Iran? They just now opened, after 30 years, their embassy in Cairo.
It's very clear that the shift we're seeing is definitely a shift towards a different foreign policy that looks at Turkey and Iran as allies and not Israel and the U.S.
Necessarily allies, or just as neighbors, where you're going to have a good neighborly relations with?
Allies, as opposed to the Israelis. Exactly, the way the old regime. And I think this is very positive in a sense. You're looking at a region where people matter to an extent that they cannot be ruled the way they were internally, and they cannot be seen by outside powers the way they were. And I think this is going to color foreign policy throughout the region, whether you have the regimes change or not.
Back to your point, Chris, about Iran and Israel. I see Iran and Israel probably being the two greatest losers in the region from a democratic, freer Arab world. What's your take?
Israel had structured its policies based on the idea that it didn't need any real peace with its neighbors. It needed peace with the dictators who were ruling its neighbors. And I think that that is going to come back to haunt it in a serious way, if only in terms of instability. Then there's a question of what we'll see, what sort of inspiration for the Palestinians will come from this greater new Arabism that we're talking about.
And to the Iranians?
And for the Iranians, well, first of all, Arabism is a threat. If that's real, then that's a real threat to the Iranians, because with their mindset, it's problematic, but also, and it will tend to marginalize them when they had seemed only a few months ago to be on a real roll. They've tried to identify with these revolutions, but here's where their real problem is. They can't identify with these revolutions because everybody knows what they did to their own similar uprising in 2009. Everybody understands that the Iranian regime may not be an Arab regime, but it's next door. And what it looks like, theocracy aside, is just another bunch of old guys telling young people what not to do.
Some people have been arguing, warning, that perhaps the Arabs will go the Iranian way, Ayatollah's ways. And some people have been arguing that they will probably go the Turkish way, the more, let's call it Islam-light way. Is there a third way? Is there an Egyptian, an Tunisian, an Arab way?
Iran is a great power in the region. It controls the whole of the northern coast of the Gulf. There's 2 million people at university. It has great oil and gas reserves. You can't keep it down. A huge mistake to try and demonize it and exclude it from the region. Huge mistake. Iran has to be brought into the security architecture of the Gulf, not excluded, for there to be peace in that region, for one thing. So, I mean, Iran and Iraq, both now under Shia leadership, form a formidable bloc. And will have a great influence in the region. Of course, the other terrible problem...
But it is that very sectarian fears, whichever you would like to call it, that also has haunted the question of Bahrain and the Bahraini struggle for freedom from monarchy.
Sectarian demons have been released by the Iraq war. And so the Shia-Sunni split is unfortunately one of the problems in the region. But I think it's terribly important to separate the religious aspect of it from the geopolitical aspect of it.
But isn't that the whole question of the Arab upheavals, uprisings, revolution, is the fact that for once people are going beyond ideological leanings, beyond sectarian underpinnings, into something perhaps newer for the region.
Sectarianism was also fed through those dictatorships. So when we're talking about Bahrain, for example, we're not talking about, you know, the Sunni Shia strife full stop. We're talking about a monarchy that belongs to the Sunni, which is a minority, impoverishing, using dictatorship, oppressing the majority of Shia. So again, we're talking about authoritarianism and oppression in a way.
Speaking about sectarianism, the idea that they discovered that the Egyptian security was involved in the burning of the church in Egypt in order to help inflamed sectarian violence.
That's no coincidence. How did Bashar and his dad maintain that power hold? Again, using the mosaic of the Syrian society, ethnicity and sects. And I think this, for the first few years, maybe several years, will prove to be very problematic. But I think on looking at longer trends, we're going to see sectarianism be dealt with in a very different way.
The momentum. Libya getting complicated, Syria getting complicated, Yemen, they're making it ever more complicated. How do you see the momentum of change towards a freer Arab region?
I think one has to say that in the region as a whole, the early months of euphoria, of happiness, have given way to a different mood now. A much
sobering,
grimmer, more brutal mood in many countries, because some of the autocrats, some of the dictators have dug their heels in and are fighting back.
Well, I think it's been slowed down by Libya particularly, and I think that people like Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen and to some extent even Bashar al-Assad in Syria sort of learned a lesson from Gaddafi, that you can hold in, you can hold on, and you can keep the world at bay and keep your own people at bay.
And if Gaddafi falls? And if
then I think you're going to see a resurgence of momentum. I think you absolutely will. I think Gaddafi coming down is going to be vital to the momentum of the revolution, not to the long-term revolution, but to the momentum of the revolution. The question I have is, what happens in Tripoli to his supporters? Do we see a relatively benevolent new regime taking over, or do we see it just start to exact the same kind of retribution and violence that supposedly it was fighting against in the first place, which has certainly been a pattern we've seen elsewhere in Africa.
But we haven't seen it in Tunisia or Egypt.
No, but they were mercifully short. The longer you force people to fight, the more the hardliners and the radicals and the extremists come to the fore, because they're the ones with the endurance.
Gentlemen, Rabab, thank you for joining Empire. And I will be back with the last thoughts. Nothing has captured the authenticity and spontaneity of the Arab awakening like the personal songs, slogans, and signs displayed in the liberated public squares of the Arab world. As the free individuals they've long craved to be, Arabs of all ages, gender, and backgrounds express their anger and frustration, uncensored, unfiltered, unedited. In the end, it took ingenious homemade signs inspired by Arab popular culture, humor, not bitterness, emotions, not empty slogans, personal touch, not party cliches, to be truly subversive. If, as one keen observer once noticed, every joke is a tiny revolution, the Arab, notably the Egyptian awakening, was revolutionary even before it succeeded. And that's the way it goes. Write to me with your observations or visit our website. Until next time.